Okay, time for us.
So thank you for joining us this Saturday morning. I see a bit of Hamilton haze out there. Maybe finally it's going to get cooler.
Yeah, it's a human right.
But today is Human Rights Day. 10th of December every year is celebrated as Human Rights Day, and it is to create awareness and mobilize political will to promote respect for the rights and freedoms enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. Yes, as far back as 1948. The theme for this year is dignity, freedom, and justice for all. To look at this with us this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Yomi Fawehime, Human Resource and Education Professional, who joins us via Zoom.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you. And we also have joining us from our studios in Abuja, the Program Officer, Policy and Legal Advocacy Center, Amarachi Onyabo. Good morning.
Good morning.
As well as Adedeji Ajari, Director, Access to Justice. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. Good morning, and thanks for joining us.
Yes, you did a very good job with it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me begin with the lady. Well, don't they say ladies first?
Well, so we hear.
So, how would you describe Nigeria in terms of the respect for human rights as of today?
With regard to human rights today, Nigeria appears to be going a bit off course, and the government needs to come back to ensure the protection, respect, and fulfillment of the rights of its citizens, as evidenced in PLAC's 2022 Annual Human Rights Report. There's a lot to be done in terms of human rights violation issues. There are several violations across the country, and the report looks at these violations in regards to threats to personal freedom and shrinking civic space, and these affect the rights enshrined in Chapter 4 of the Nigerian Constitution, speaking to fundamental human rights. And we're calling, PLAC in that report called on the Nigerian government to take steps to ensure that it promotes the rule of law, and also take steps to address insecurity, because that is a big challenge for most of the rights under Chapter 4. Insecurity violates a lot of the rights under Chapter 4, as evidenced in that report. So there's a lot of work to be done with regard to human rights violation in Nigeria.
Well, it's interesting when you put it that way, Mr. Onyabo. When you say we need to come back home, so to speak, that seems like to be what you're saying. But Mr. Fawehime, it's not exactly what the United Nations says about Nigeria's human rights record, because according to the UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Nigeria, there has been some improvement in the human rights situation in the country compared to what obtained many years ago.
Thanks for that question, and I'm laughing because you asked me the question. You know, one of the beauty of history is the ability to look back and see what has happened. We came from very terrible human rights records under the military. I remember many years ago where in Nigeria, you know, when people talk about we have limited freedom, I used to ask people that, okay, so where is your reference point? Because there were times that news broadcasters like you were whisked from the studio straight to prison. We had a case where two broadcasters with Guardian, Tunde Thompson and Irabo, were jailed for issues that bordered on their right to freedom of expression. So that's where we're coming from, where it was so easy for people to be put to the gulag for any offense, including suspicion. We had a situation at a point where the chief of staff to the head of state at that point said national security is whatever the head of state considers to be national security. Many journalists, many human resource professionals, many Nigerians were mouthed out in various ages just because they spoke against government. So that's where we're coming from. So we made some progress, and like the previous speaker said, we still have opportunities, but we're not coming from. We're moving in the right direction. Of course, the reality of it is that there will be occasional times when people want to deviate and take us to the back. Like we had a recent case where a student was picked from a university in the north because of what he had written on Twitter about somebody hiring, so not somebody in government, the wife of somebody in government, and was picked and whisked to Abuja. You have those situations, but part of the fact that we're making progress was there was a lot of talk online, and that made this person withdraw the case, and the student was returned back to there. So that's part of the progress we are making. When people make those deviations, people talk about it and say, no, this is not where we're going, and there's a backup. Of course, we also remember that part of the progress is now we have a National Human Rights Commission in Nigeria, for example. I mean, that institution did not exist many years ago. That's part of the progress we are making. So we're making progress here and there. We had the NSAS crisis, and people talked about it, which was about abuse of human rights, and state governments and the federal government set up panels to investigate and to compensate as much as it's not perfect. It's a journey, right? Human rights is a journey, because beyond where you have to be every day.
That journey, well, there are many who would say the journey is taking way too long. I mean, just as you said, I mean, we're coming back from the days of a political impasse and more state-centric security as opposed to citizen-centric security. And those would also argue that one of the challenges, you know, of human rights in the country is because of its state-centricity as opposed to citizen-centricity. What would be your take on that?
You know, those concepts are real concepts, but at the end of the day, it comes back to the responsibility of each individual. You know, we had the time in this country, our police was called the Nigerian Police Force. When you say somebody is a member of a force, where are you discussing human rights with that person? You said he's in a force. That's what you called him. You didn't say it's in the service. And so it's not set up to render a police service to you. It's rendered to enforce something, and that's what we used to call Nigerian Police Force. That's where we're coming from. But well, those conversations have been had. So it's very true. Quite a lot of our state institutions are structured around the leaders, not even around the state, around the leaders who enforce those things. Also, part of it is also the fact that many times, many people in government in Nigeria, again, remember where we're coming from. We're coming from the concept of traditional rulers who we call Kabiyesi, for example, which in Yoruba language means somebody that cannot be questioned. So many people took on those roles believing that they cannot be questioned. So they created institutions, they created organizations that reinforce the Kabiyesi concept of leaders. Until date, we see our leaders who have that idea that they can't be questioned, they can't be corrected, and they can't be wrong. So that's part of where we are coming from. And the opportunity we have is for us to sustain that rule of democracy. One of the things I've always argued is the fact that, you know, it was the late Professor Kwadake that said you cannot have democracy without Democrats. What we have in Nigeria now is that we have democracy, but we don't have Democrats. So what we have now is that somebody will be willing to go for election because it's part of the tenets of democracy, but it's because he's not a Democrat, he's willing to buy votes. So we have people, for example, who are in power who still have this Kabiyesi concept and believe they cannot be questioned. And that's why those institutions will serve them and never serve the people.
Mr. Fawaini, you spoke about this journey and that we are moving gradually towards the goal, even though the movement is at snail pace. But let me just run this by you. A policeman goes to arrest someone in Nigeria, and it's not that they want to invite someone for questioning. They don't actually go there to invite. They actually go there to bully, and they beat, and they kick. And it is for the guy, I mean, it's like you are guilty until you prove yourself innocent. Whereas in other crimes, it is innocent until proven guilty. So this journey of ours, is it taking all these into cognizance?
Well, great question. Again, that's why we said that this human rights issue is a journey, right? Um, um, just yesterday, one of the 4 policemen that were involved in the gruesome murder of George Floyd on the streets of Minnesota in the U.S. was jailed for 3 years. Just yesterday. So the point is, the policing itself is one of the institutions that have been created over time that has been designed in various ways. So in Nigeria, we, for example, say our police is not citizen-centered. In other places, their complaint is that their police does not respect the rights of women or the respect of black people or the respect of colored people, as the case may be. So it comes back. And, one of the things I always try to emphasize about human rights, that while it is human rights, it is also humans that need to respect those rights. So whether those humans are lecturers in a university or are policemen or are leaders or are parents or are teachers, it is those individuals that still need to respect the human rights of others. Because what happens is we have a situation where people talk a lot about human rights, expecting people to respect their own human rights, but they don't have a sense of obligation to respect the human rights of others. And that's where we have these contradictions,
Okay.
Whether it's in policing or whatsoever.
Well, Mr. Fawemi, I'm going to come back to you in a bit, but let me ask Mr. Ajare this question around this same conversation on human rights. If you would, well, you may want to respond to some of the things that you heard, to begin with, Mr. Ajare. So, but looking at your assessment to, of our handling of human rights issues in the country so far, there are questions around, well, one of the things, of course, one of the ambits of human rights is the right to fairness, justice and all those things. So in terms of access to justice, thankfully you are Director Access to Justice. How would you say we fare with regards to access to justice as a human right?
Well, thank you so much for this question. First, I would tie this to the discourse around the improvements in our human rights situation in Nigeria generally. And without any doubt, we have witnessed some improvements over the past decades, especially as we have moved into civil rule after 1999. But then, I think it's important for us to also understand that what we have had is a situation where as we, try to eradicate some violations, it appears like they are replaced by other violations. So, for instance, you will find that while maybe some of the things we experienced in terms of political rights under the military, while we're doing away with them and then we're advancing, and then the advent of, say, social media and the growth of the use of internet in Nigeria, of course, created a new problem, and then you now have a situation where you have citizens using these means to communicate grievances and communicate their displeasure with government. And then you have governments repressing these things. And so you now have an incursion into the civic space, a new problem. And that, of course, is indicative of, for instance, what happened last year when the Nigerian government, after a tweet by the Nigerian president was deleted by Twitter, and then the Nigerian government went all out and then decided to ban the use of Twitter in Nigeria. Of course, that has now been decided by the ECOWAS court as being unconstitutional, and the court has also demanded for, amongst other things, a guarantee of non-repetition. So you would find that, yes, we are making some progress, but sometimes we take 2 steps forward and then 1 backward. So at the end of the day, we appear to be in a cycle. However, in terms of access to justice generally in Nigeria, yes, there are improvements to the extent that people now have more avenue to express grievances. And I think, okay, perhaps what will be a source of concern for people should be perhaps access to legal aid services, most importantly, because you will find that most of the times victims of human rights violations are indigent persons who cannot afford the services of a lawyer and the cost of litigation. And when you look at the sheer number of violations that occur in the country daily, you will find that when you compare that with the number of, say, lawyers that offer pro bono legal services, it's still quite inadequate. And so, yes, there is need for us to make more and more progress. The fundamental human rights, fundamental rights enforcement procedure rules intended, it is clear that the intentions of the makers of the rules was to actually make it easy for persons who believe that their rights have been violated to access the courts. But it appears again that our judges are not as progressive as judges, for instance, in other jurisdictions. For instance, in India, where they have the same fundamental rights enforcement procedure rules, the courts there have held that a litigant or a person who complains of violation of his right can come with as much as a mere patch of paper with a complaint, and it will be heard. But we're still restricted by a lot of technicalities in our courts today.
Perhaps
and so
that
you
also
find a lot of
speaks
cases
to,
that go on and on and on and are eventually thrown out.
Yeah, Mr. Jari, perhaps that speaks to the practitioners in the field. By the way, I mean, when you talked about the fact that government, you know, clamped down on a particular social media platform, you would also know that there are countries in the world where certain platforms that are popular in Nigeria are not allowed at all in some other countries. I mean, the nationals of those countries haven't said, you know, cried wolf, for instance.
Are those democracies?
And, you know, well, some of them are democracies in their own right. At the end of the day, they have people living among them. So perhaps one can say it depends on the government of the day and what the people agree to that they would go with. But you may want to respond to that as well. But speaking to the practice of justice or judiciary, okay, I'll come to Ms. Onyabo in a moment, but speaking to the system of accessing justice, is it the people, the rules, or the practitioners who we need to, you know, who we need to dust up, or what we need to tinker with? And what role has government to do in that? You've talked about three people. You've talked about the practitioners, you've talked about the processes, you've talked about the people who bring the cases to the judiciary. At what point do we have issues that we need to tinker with?
Thank you. I would address first the issue that you raised regarding some countries that do not even allow certain platforms, social media platforms at all. And I would say, you see, the concept of human rights is universal. In fact, that is what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So if you have countries where they have repressive laws that do not allow its citizens to enjoy some of these rights, I do not think we should emulate them in Nigeria. Those are not the countries we should emulate. And like some people have said, if we want to do that, perhaps we would go the whole hog and probably emulate some of these countries in implementing death penalties, for instance, for corruption-related cases, but I'm sure we would not want to go there. So we should not emulate countries who are not doing the things that are right, and it is not right for countries to stop their citizens from enjoying their rights to freedom of expression and freedom of information. However, now going to your main question now as regards access to justice. Now, you see, at the end of the day, all actors have a role or the other to play. And I'll start first with the government. Government must, of course, it is part of its sworn duty, its sworn responsibility under the Universal Declaration for Human Rights and under the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights and a lot of other international instruments to educate its citizenry on their rights, these rights that are contained in these instruments that we have spoken about earlier. Government must do that. It must make its citizens aware of the opportunities they have to air their grievances and to seek redress and seek justice in the courts and through other channels. That's one. The judiciary must also learn to be more progressive in its outlook towards issues like this. So, for instance, you have a situation where a citizen has come to allege that, my husband was arrested by DSS in the middle of the night from our home, and look, I don't know where he is. And then he goes to court, and then she goes to court, and then DSS simply comes to say, we don't know his whereabouts, we don't have his whereabouts, and that's all. I think we must leave that era and go to an era where the court asks that DSS should positively demonstrate, positively by bringing evidence now that it does not have that person in its custody. Because when you look at the balance of powers, that citizen does not have the powers to prove its case as against the DSS that has all of the facilities, all of the funding, all of the tools and devices with which it can make its case. Now, beyond that, we also need to now go to lawyers. A lot more lawyers need to open up and start making legal aid services available to citizens. Wow. And yes, I understand that the economy is making a lot of lawyers shy away from providing pro bono legal services. But then that is, I think, what should be part of the primary duties of a lawyer. And so maybe the Nigerian Bar Association has a lot more role to play in there in terms of conscientizing its members to take some of these actions. And then as regards the citizens, of course, we have already said government must educate, and when they do, citizens must take advantage. They must become conscientized. They must take advantage of all of these opportunities that are available to them. And I think if we do that, we're going to make a lot more progress. Like Mr. Fawemi said earlier, perfection may not come so soon. In fact, I do not think we're going to have a utopia, a human rights utopia. But we must constantly and consistently seek to improve the human rights situations at every point in time.
Mr. Yabo, we cannot talk human rights without discussing the inalienable rights of human beings to associating, their right to association. And we know that, for instance, if any group is planning a protest, they have to go and get permission from law enforcement agencies, one or two of them. And in certain cases, that permission was denied. What are your thoughts about that?
Going back to my point on shrinking civic space, like you rightly said, people have the right to associate, people have the right to assemble for whatever common interests that they have. But the way the Nigerian context is at the moment, it seems like there's a government clamp down on what it perceives as criticism. So like you rightly said, sometimes you go to the security agencies to get permission and you don't get it because anything that is seen as maybe criticizing the government in some way and there's a clamp down, that's the reaction you get. And we have the classic example of the NSAS protests from 2020, and 2 years after, some of the demands of the protesters that the government said it was going to meet are still unmet, and some people are still in custody just because they came out to protest. So there's that clamp down, and the government needs to be able to provide a safe space for individuals and organizations to come together to express whatever issues they have with the government, and then the government should respond by engaging rather than clamping down. But we don't really have that. That is what we have seen in recent times, and a lot of work really needs to go into that to free up civic space and to allow people to assemble, to allow people to protest, to allow people to engage, and to tell the government the ways in which it can improve in its conduct.
Okay. Mr. Fawemi, you are an educationist, so of course your interest lies mainly in the area of human rights in the workplace. That I work for you, does that make me your slave and you can push me around as you like and hit me because I work for you? Mr. Fawemi?
Part of what the Nigerian Constitution says, thanks for that question, ma. The workplace is a hotbed for human rights, and the reason is because in a workplace, all the fundamental human rights are supposed to be respected in addition to the workplace rights. So, I mean, there seems to be like two general broad categorization of human rights now. There's what is called the fundamental human rights, typically enshrined in the Constitution, typically justiciable and enforceable in court. But now there are other sets of rights now that are usually called socioeconomic rights, of which labor rights is one of them. So, for example, based on our constitution, based on Nigerian signing to the various ILO conventions, for example, the right to form a union has become it has become a justiciable right. So I have a right to join a union. I also have a right to engage in collective bargaining. And you know, the theme for today is about dignity. I also have a right to dignity of a person in the workplace. So, for example, there are certain jobs you can't give a human being to do based on the general definition of the word dignity. Somebody cannot be put under forced labor. Actually, our constitution clearly states that. So you can't force anybody to work for you. So, for example, if somebody decides to resign today, I say, I have attended my letter of resignation. You don't have a right to say, you know, in Nigeria, they'll say, we don't accept your resignation. In our laws, you don't accept resignation. You are told, I have resigned, and I'm gone. There's nothing, when an employee says, I'm going, he's gone. That's the right he has in the workplace. There are also rights in the workplace that is based on gender. Part of it are the issues around gender parity, around equal work for equal pay. It's now become a right. It's also now become a right that you can't just sack people the way you like. If you sack them or you ask them to go and you write them a letter, which the law says you should do, you must state the reason why you are asking them to go, and they can contest it in court. We actually had like 3 recent cases in Nigeria where we had for the first time a sexual harassment case in a workplace was brought to court, and it was won because the person that was harassed, and then so we have those plethora of justice. But you know, one of the beautiful things, and I mean, as the previous speaker was talking about access to justice for the workplace, part of the improvement, because again, we can choose to look at the positives, right? Part of the improvements is, for example, we now have a national industrial court, a court dedicated to workplace and labor issues. So it's part of this access to justice. Before now in Nigeria, if you had a case against your employer, you go and queue up at the high court, and that can take years. But now with the dedicated courts, and they are making great pronouncements. One of the very recent ones is around a case on pregnancies, where somebody was laid off, and this lady was pregnant, and the lady went to court to argue that pregnancy is related to my gender, which is being female. Therefore, if I'm sacked because I'm pregnant, it's discrimination. And she brilliantly worked the case because the court held, and rightly so, that pregnancy is related to it. There are also issues of health. There is one of the biggest banks in Nigeria, actually one of the oldest banks in Nigeria, started an interview process with somebody, and then they went to do the medical, and then they realized the person was HIV/AIDS positive. And this bank said it was not going to continue. And the person went to court to say that because of the fact that there was a law signed by the former president, Goodluck Jonathan, that you can't discriminate against me because of my HIV status. And it won in court. Actually, the bank appealed to settle out of court and paid them a huge compensation. So the workplace has a set of laws that is dynamic, that the Nigerian Industrial Court is expanding. And it's important for employers of labor to do that. Part of it is to be paid for the money.
Mr. Fawemi, just a second. That's not to say, because there's something you said the other time, that at the end of the day, it's got to do with the people themselves. And I think, you know, it's something that I'd like to take Mr. Ajare on. I mean, we've been speaking, Mr. Ajare, about what government needs to do, what the authorities need to do, what the judicial system need to do. But at the end of the day, it's about people. It is people that, you know, incur into other people's rights. Road use, for instance, there is a path that is supposed to go, the roads, vehicles are supposed to go. Anyone driving against that traffic is against the law and is against the human rights of other people. I know that you have spoken to the fact that people need to be conscientized about human rights, you know, and all of that. This issue is not new. How do we exactly go about this? Because it seems like it's a lot more to do with culture than rules, regulations, and laws. What would be your take on how we approach this, particularly from the local levels?
Right, thank you. You see, you in your question, you have actually hinted at what is primarily the issue. It's culture, really. A lot of, and when we say culture, we're not even looking at, we're looking at our habits, our attitudes developed over time. You know, first, we have a situation here where there's a lot of frustration out here. People have lost confidence in our judicial system and our criminal justice system. And so you find a lot of people who do not want to take cases, for instance, to courts, and they would rather settle the issues either through self-help, what we call jungle justice today. And it is because there will be allegations that, oh, previous, for instance, suspects that were caught and arrested and handed over to law enforcement and security agencies were found walking free weeks after with no repercussions. So people would rather handle the issues out here without even taking them to the proper regular courts of law or the law enforcement agents. Now that's one. Beyond that, of course, people also find that, look, it's frustrating seeking justice in our system. So you have, for instance, a case of rape. There is a case of rape of a minor that has been on since 2017. And till date, only until a few weeks ago was the hearing commenced. And there were a lot of issues, including change of judges, including transfer, and so many issues. And now, in the course of the whole trial, one or two persons who should have served as witnesses either died or relocated and could not come back to come and testify. This has frustrated the mother of the minor so much that she has lost confidence. And in fact, she has asked that the matter be withdrawn. There are similar cases all over the place. So a lot of these things are factors. They are issues that eventually become, that make people lose confidence in the system, and eventually they either take the laws into their hands, resorting to self-help, or because we're very religious people, you find a lot of people say, look, I leave it to God. I leave it to God. And that attitude, that culture is what we need to actually now attack. And like you said, from the grassroots. And therefore, it will take a lot, all hands must be on deck to get this done, including the government, including traditional leaders, including religious leaders. Everybody must start conscientizing people, educating people, making them see the need for them to seek justice through the appropriate measures and to be patient and be persistent, because we have also seen cases that took quite a long time, but eventually justice, though delayed, was eventually delivered. And it may be worth the while at the end of the day. In many cases, it will be worth the while. So people must learn to also be persistent in seeking for justice through the proper channels.
Mr. Yabo, how much advocacy is going on with law enforcement people? I ask this because I know of someone who was arrested, and the grounds for the arrest was, and I quote, too much knowing his rights. So, how aware are they that even though you think I'm a criminal, I do have some rights, and until my case is proven in court, I am innocent. So you can't say you are arresting me because I am telling you my rights.
I would say
that question is for Mr. Onyabo.
The way I see it, at access to justice,
it's for Mr. Onyabo, Mr. Ajari.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so with regard to advocacy in relation to security forces, I think that there's just need for holistic reorientation of all the security agencies, really. In 2020, a new Police Act was assented to by the president, and it provides so many wonderful human rights safeguards. However, I think there needs to be like detailed training for security agencies on human rights protection. It's a culture thing, like Mr. Ajari discussed. It's about people, really. I think Nigeria has so many good laws, but implementing those laws has been a challenge over time. And it goes back to both the people, the government, and the security agencies that are responsible for enforcing our laws to also take time to be reoriented. All of us, even Nigerians, knowing our rights as well, even though he said that someone was arrested and by the police for knowing a lot of his rights, that is wrong, really. So I think it's an orientation issue, and citizens and the government are need to be ready to unlearn everything that's the culture, the norm that we have been going through with these past years, and imbibe what is proper and the correct way of doing things, and apply due process in all our procedures and our conduct.
Well, Mr. Yaba, I'm going to stay with you for a bit.
May I also add a word in that regard?
You will, Mr. Ajari, but let me follow up quickly on something for Mr. Nyabo. I mean, your report, for instance, says one key finding made is that Nigeria is going through a period of great economic difficulties that have formed the backdrop or often provided the impetus for many of the rights violations that happen in the country. Perhaps it might help to try to narrow down what sector your report or your findings say is where our human rights are most bedeviled. Let me give you an instance, and this is something the police, for instance, have been doing for a long time, trying to conscientize people and educate them. And look, these are the things that a policeman can ask you. A policeman cannot ask you for this, but they can ask you for this. Anyone that asks you for something that they're not supposed to ask you, I mean, is not in line with the law. But you also, of course, honed it in by saying that sometimes people don't even know their rights. Yes, some people know their rights too much. But sometimes some people don't even know their rights, and all of that. So how do we approach this? I know Mr. Ajari spoke about us, getting more knowledge of our rights and all of those things. But in a situation where people don't know their rights and there is an attempt to, run over them simply because they don't know their rights, what do the people do?
Okay, so I'll take your first question on the report on the economic downturn in Nigeria at the moment. There's increased government spending and borrowing, and our revenues are plunging, and we have a foreign exchange rates crisis. We're seeing high levels of unemployment and of poverty. So this is what the country looks like at the moment. And with these conditions, then the next thing you see is increasing crime rates, which is feeding into this widespread insecurity that we're seeing today. And in that regard, you see that it's the economic crisis. In the backdrop of the economic crisis, human rights concerns are exacerbated. And if you have a good number of citizens who are living in poverty like this, for instance, I'm just connecting this to your next question. These people don't even care about human rights at this point. These people are just trying to make ends meet. And with regard to the economic situation, the Plaque's call to the government is to manage the economy better, because in section 14 of the Constitution, subsection 2, paragraph B, it says that the welfare and the security of the people would be the primary purpose of government. So these two are intertwined, and when you have this economic situation, this economic downturn, then invariably it's going to feed into insecurity as well, and it's also the responsibility of the government to secure the lives and the property of its citizens. So if you're looking at people who you have the right to life, you're alive, but what is the quality of life that you're living today? And if that is the state and condition in which people find themselves, then you can also see how knowledge of their rights are not the major things on their minds at that moment. So about sensitizing people on their rights, I think we also need the we also need a conducive environment where things are working well, where people have access to the means of livelihood, to adequate means of livelihood. And in that scenario, I see people who are going from just trying to survive daily to being interested in knowing how they should associate and what their other rights are. We spoke, the National Orientation Agency is also there. It could also help with things like this. We have many organizations working on human rights protection in Nigeria, and I'm sure they produce different materials, different awareness materials. But I still take the stand that many Nigerians are living in not so good conditions, and I don't think the first thing on their minds right now are their rights.
Well, I think you even delineated it already by saying what we have in the Constitution is right to life. Right to quality life, maybe that is subjective, unfortunately. Well, let's take your closing moments now, ladies and gentlemen. And let me begin with, and of course, Mr. Ajari, maybe that will be your own last word, the one that you wanted to add the other time. So let me begin with you, Mr. Ajari. Your last comments.
Okay. Thank you. So I was going to just speak regarding educating not just the citizen, like you said, of course, even the officers themselves. And at Access to Justice, in the past 2-3 years, we have trained over 1,000 police officers on human rights and more particularly the rights of suspects. The rights of suspects. However, most of these people have been the officers on the lower rung of the ladder, because the thinking had been that these are the people who have the direct interaction with the people. They are the first contact that the people usually have. They are the ones who arrest. They are the ones who investigate, and that's what we've been doing.
Okay.
However, in my opinion, in the past week, I started thinking that perhaps we have been getting it wrong. Perhaps we need to start focusing on actually training and educating the top officers, really. Because something happened last week. The director general
Mr. Ajari,
of the DSS
it's supposed to be your last word, and
mind.
it's sounding like another lecture altogether. But maybe what we'll do is call you up some other time to have this. But I think the point has been made. We should not only focus on those on the lower rung of the ladder, but to speak to those at the top as well. Mr. Fawemi, your last words.
I think I just want to reiterate the importance of we as human beings, understanding our rights, and secondly, respecting the rights of others. I think it's when this two happens that we're going to have progress in terms of human rights.
It's one thing to know your rights, and another thing to understand it. Great one.
Ms.
Samarachi Onyabo, your last words.
Okay, I'm just going to say that the Nigerian government needs to really tackle insecurity, because insecurity breeds a lot of human rights violation, especially fundamental human rights. And as such, it should not just say that it is tackling the issue of insecurity, but it must be seen by the people, it must be perceived by the people to be tackling this issue. And that is the only way to restore the confidence of Nigerians in the ability of its government to keep people safe and keep their property safe.
Thank you very much. Amarachi Onyabo, Program Officer, Policy and Legal Advocacy Center. We also had in our Abuja studio with Ms. Onyabo, Adedeji Ajare, Director, Access to Justice. And we had Mr. Yomi Fawemi, who joined us via Zoom. Mr. Fawemi is a human resource and education professional. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to share your insights with us this morning on this very important topic on this day being Human Rights Day. Thank you very much.
I've heard what you have to say. What I have to do is in my heart.
So back after now, take a break, and we'll be back for more. Stay with us.